Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
I've been paying close attention for the past couple of months to advances in artificial intelligence. I've been using ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. Anybody can access it online. I started out about a month ago handing it a URL to an article and said, read this and write me a 300-word summary. And it did. And it was a decent summary. And that, of course, got me a little bit concerned because my whole point there was to see what would happen if, when I give, as I do, give my students something to read and say, write me a summary of this thing, if indeed they could use this ChatGPT to do it for them. And lo and behold, they can. However, in an interesting twist, I would take the summary that the artificial intelligence wrote and copy it back into the artificial intelligence and ask it, did you write this? And it will say, oh, yes, I did. So I did that. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was working on an article, actually, for your publication, AIER. I got to the end. I couldn't get a good closing paragraph. I'm trying different things and nothing's working. So I took the article as I'd written it, copied it into the artificial intelligence and said, hey, write me a closing paragraph. And it did. It was okay. It wasn't great. So I said to it, okay, this is all right, but make it more punchy. And it did. It made it even better. It was a fabulous thing. I did not, in the end, use the paragraph. I just thought it was interesting that it could produce it. And then last week, I gave it a word problem that I had given to my statistics students. It just sets up a scenario and you have to calculate some probabilities to answer the question, this sort of thing. The artificial intelligence solved the problem. It lays it all out exactly like I would have had my students lay it out, defining events and calculating probabilities and translating the result back into English. But it made an error. At one point in its calculations, it assumed that two random events were independent when in fact you could not assume that. So I said to the artificial intelligence, well, okay, this is all right, except in step number 3, you assume the two events are independent. You can't assume that. So the artificial intelligence goes off and it comes back to me and it says, okay, if you can't assume that they're independent, then you can't find the answer for the following reasons. And it lays out all this thing. To which I respond, yes, you can. You have to use Bayes' theorem. And the artificial intelligence comes back and says, okay, using Bayes' theorem, I could do the following things, and it finds the answer. This is just astounding. It's like carrying on a conversation, not with an expert, but with a well-prepared student, you might say. But that brings me to my interesting story for the week, and that is, in 1981, art collector George Winward thought he had found a genuine Raphael. That's a painting by the Italian artist Raffaello Sanzio, who died in the 1500s. The painting had no documented pedigree. Its artist was unknown. But Winward noticed a resemblance between the figures in the painting and a famous Raphael, the Sistine Madonna. Winward was convinced, but he couldn't get any experts to agree with him. He dies in 1997. But recently, researchers have fed an image of the painting into an artificial intelligence and asked it, who painted this? And the artificial intelligence came back and said it's highly likely that this is a Raphael masterpiece. I have no conclusion to any of this other than amazement that we're standing at the cusp of what's going to be a marked change in how people, particularly people like us who work with our heads, do their work. People are concerned that artificial intelligence is going to replace us, and it is going to replace some of us. I'm much more interested in what we can do working alongside it.
Leave it to you. You got all the details right and the story wrong. The real role that AI is going to play is it's going to give friends and girlfriends to all kinds of people.
Isn't it the case that every new piece of technology that comes along, probably going all the way back to the printing press or before, the first application has something to do with sex?
That's not wrong, but this goes a little deeper. We've got this loneliness problem in the modern world. We're just at the beginning of this. Imagine what that looks like in another year. I've got both better and worse news. I caught a poll from Gallup. Everybody in the world, well, everybody in the United States at least, is starting to agree with us. They cite as the top problem in the United States, government.
Just generically, government is the problem.
I think it's largely because of the wording of a question. It's the government / poor leadership, not just the government simply. We're up from 15% on that response in November, December to 21% in January.
And that's the number one response.
That is correct.
What comes in number two?
Inflation, number two. I really would have thought inflation would have come in first. It's unlikely to me that people have linked inflation with government incompetence. Immigration is third, and the economy in general is fourth. After that, it falls off quite a bit.
It's actually sad that they confounded the question like that and said government / leadership. You could answer government is a problem simply because of Joe Biden. His poll numbers are remarkably low.
Well, they're not that bad. They're about 43%.
Oh, are they up that high?
That's where a number of recent presidents have kind of bottomed out.
Maybe it's Kamala Harris I'm thinking of.
That might be right. And it certainly is Congress, which is often 18 to 20%.
Right.
The lowest I can seem to remember a president was about 36, 37%. I'm a little irked that they would bifurcate inflation and the economy in general. It seems that those are a couple of the same answers, but I think by and large, these are not the incorrect responses. And I often think that people come up with the incorrect responses on these sorts of things. Crime and violence is 4%. The American people, maybe they've been listening to Words and Numbers these many years, they just understand that this isn't the big deal that the media would have them believe it is. Ethical, moral, family decline, also 4%.
They're 7 times more concerned with government than they are with crime and violence.
5 and some change, 21% versus 4%. People are thinking pretty clearly about these things, and we'll leave a link in the show notes for you.
What scares me with answers like that is the person who's thinking to himself, yeah, government's the problem. We need the other party in there. Then it will be okay. That's not seeing government as the problem. That's seeing a particular party as the problem.
Which brings us, of course, to the foolishness of the week. We head over to the great state of Ohio, Upper Sandusky, Ohio. There's a relatively active homeschooling group in Upper Sandusky, Ohio, and they're Nazis.
Really?
We have a neo-Nazi dissident homeschool group.
That's weird.
Yeah, the weird part is that they have 2,500 members.
Good God.
On a Telegram channel, which means they have more than 2,500 members in real life. What in God's green earth is going on in Upper Sandusky?
How strange. I always associate homeschoolers with religious types.
Well,
I guess this is religion of a different sort.
Of a sort, one might in fact say. I remember losing my mind when my kids were in a homeschool group in Utah. One of the women who ran the thing thought it was hilarious that her son referred to himself as the soup Nazi in the lunchroom and refused to let people have their lunch. And I said, don't you think in a homeschool environment, referring to yourself as a soup Nazi might be inappropriate? Her response was to threaten to have her husband come and beat me up.
She was wrong on several counts there.
It's hard to know what was wrong with her. I think the answer was a whole lot of things. Her husband never did show up, although I would have loved to have met him. I'm sure he would have been a jolly fellow to hang out with for the afternoon. I wouldn't let my kids go back there. If that's what you let happen, I know you're going to let a lot of other things happen. I'm not terribly surprised when we find out that there's a neo-Nazi homeschool group in Sandusky, Ohio, but my God, there's so many of them. Katya Lawrence, 37, also shares examples of how her family embraces Nazi ideology, including baking a Führer cake for Hitler's birthday and sharing a recording of her children shouting Sieg Heil. You and I often, unlike many classical liberals, will point to the problems that children bring. What do you do when you're seeing children being raised like this? Most people in our orbit say, well, the right of parentage is absolute and you have to take a hands-off, live and let live approach. And yet you see the limits of that here. People like us will also say parents should be able to school their children any way they see fit, a point of view I'm broadly sympathetic with. We homeschooled all 3 of our children. And yet when you see this, I'd shut this down at the drop of a hat. Does that make me a bad classical liberal? Maybe, but it probably also makes me a pretty good human being. And herein lies the friction that we often come up against. People will often get on our backs about our willingness to allow for some kind of authority in society. And yet, do you not want some kind of authority here?
The issue here is not teaching Nazism. It's specifically teaching it to children.
I'm going to go further than that, teaching Nazism simply.
Oh, no.
Fine by me. Let's not do that.
No, I couldn't go with you there. It's a small step between that and declaring all manner of things hate speech. And we've both taken a firm stand against that.
There's no such thing as a Nazi I wouldn't fight, and there's no such thing as a Nazi I wouldn't shut down.
Sure, but to invoke the power of government to do so, I'm not comfortable going there. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. If you're a full-time college student looking for something educational, fun, and free, apply to join me and James and several faculty who have appeared on Words and Numbers at the inaugural summer seminar on the theory and practice of classical liberalism. The week-long seminar is hosted by the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University and will be held June 5th through the 10th. There's no charge, and meals and lodging are provided. To apply, see the link in the show notes. Samuel Gregg is Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy at the American Institute for Economic Research, contributing editor at Law and Liberty, and an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute and visiting scholar in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He has authored 16 books, including the prize-winning The Commercial Society, Wilhelm Röpke's Political Economy, Becoming Europe, the prize-winning Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, and most recently, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. He has authored over 400 articles and opinion pieces and writes regularly on political economy, finance, American conservatism, Western civilization, and natural law theory. Sam, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Anthony, thanks for having me. Great to be with you, James.
Oh, it's fantastic having you with us.
I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I was on the road for some hours yesterday and today, and thankfully I found an audio version, so I listened to it the whole time. Just had a wonderful time with it.
What we've learned is that Antony is too lazy to read. I too enjoyed the book, Sam, but I looked at written words on pages the way you intended that to happen. And I have to say, it was quite good, quite comprehensive. This is, I think, one of the few books that we could recommend to our readers as covering some familiar ground that we cover, but covering some unfamiliar ground too, and getting into things in a pretty comprehensive manner. What was it that had you start writing this book? What was it that had you say, here's a giant hole in the market that I think I can fill?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that, and you both know this very well, that since 2015, we've had a significant uptick, which has not gone away. In fact, it's intensifying, of people on, let's call it the right, moving away from the case for free markets, and even more broadly, away from the idea of limited government. I mean, there have always been people on the right who have had a more expansive view of the state's economic role than any of us would have. There have always been people on the American right who have endorsed a more proactive role for the government in various segments of society. They've always been there, but really since 2015, these issues have become a major dividing point on, let's call it the right, and have really upturned what had been a sort of consensus that had existed on the right, particularly around economic issues, that I think had really crystallized by the time that Ronald Reagan became president. And I found really from 2015 onwards, I spent a lot more time arguing with people on the right about economic questions, not just economic policy questions, but the whole place of free market economics in the conservative lexicon, than I did with people on the left. I mean, people on the left weren't changing their opinions, but it was very apparent to me that there was a big schism really opening up on the right around economic questions. I discovered that I was one of the few people who would be conventionally identified as being a relatively conservative person on the right, etc., but who was remaining solid in terms of a commitment to free market economics. And someone had to fill the gap, right? Someone had to get into some of these things, because my concern was, and I'm sure you both noticed this as well, lots and lots of younger center-right people were drifting towards things like protectionism, industrial policy, even what you might call conservative versions of stakeholder capitalism, and a general skepticism, I would say, that goes even beyond those things towards skepticism about the American founding, skepticism towards things like the Scottish Enlightenment, and really a questioning of what you might call the fusionist movement that began to emerge in the 1950s and had really solidified itself as the place in which most center-right people, for all their disagreements, found a type of common home. And it seemed to me that a book was necessary to intervene into this discussion, not just in terms of explaining how we ended up the way we are, but also explaining why the economic ideas being advanced by some sections of the right are terribly wrong. But we also needed a book that explained in fresh terms, in a way that's fitted up for the 2020s rather than the 1980s, the case for markets that center-right people could get behind.
I've observed the same thing you're describing. I've often wondered, of course, we're speaking broadly, is it the case that people on the right have given up their commitment to freedom, to liberty, or is it the case that the ground has shifted such that the things that are now of greater interest are things that were never within their concept of freedom and liberty? In other words, circumstances are causing us to realize that they actually aren't any more interested in freedom in the pure sense than are people on the left. It's just they apply it in different ways.
I think it's both. I think it's very much both. So we have new problems that have emerged, which have caused some people on the right to question their commitment to free markets. The rise of China would be an obvious factor, I think, that's on a lot of people's minds, which has caused some people on the right to say, well, I'm in favor of free markets, but we need industrial policy if we're going to confront a resurgent China. So that's one thing. It's also a reemergence of particular ideas in the sense that, as you both know, some of these ideas came bubbling to the surface in the early 1990s with Pat Buchanan's political campaign. Pat Buchanan was saying, free trade is destroying America. We need to get back to a situation whereby we embrace protectionist arrangements. And that went along with a type of critique of the state of American culture and some of the things that Buchanan and others didn't like what they saw happening in the United States. And I think we've seen some of those things coming up as well today. But to get to the second thing of what you're really talking about, I think in some respects, we've seen a certain delinkage, if you like, in some parts of America of the linkage between liberty on the one hand and virtue on the other. And for many conservatives of our generation, these two things sort of naturally went together. These were not things that were seen as being in tension. Now, certainly the left, I think, they don't talk very much about virtue, right? They don't talk about these sorts of things. And it seems like, except when it comes to economics, they have a fairly libertine understanding of what they think freedom is about. And I think on the right, we've seen some people, some conservatives saying, well, we don't think that the virtue side of the fusionist equation has been taken as seriously as it needs to be. They would argue that classical liberals haven't lived up to their side of the bargain of taking the virtue side of things particularly seriously. And there may be some truth to that. I think there is a certain degree of truth to some of these arguments. But in many cases, what this has meant, both the specifics of the present, but some of these long-standing tensions have led to some conservatives basically to say that liberty needs to be relegated down the list of priorities. So they won't say, let's give up on freedom, let's give up on liberty. We just don't think it should be given the type of priority and prominence that the center-right in America, at least the American center-right, has long given it, particularly from the 1950s onwards. So I think it's a combination of both these things, circumstances plus some deeper philosophical tensions that have always been there, but which now have become much more prominent in, let's call it, center-right discourse.
Twice now you've used the word fusionist. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Fusionism is a way of describing, as the word suggests, the type of fusion between those on the center-right whose priority was very much about liberty. People like Friedrich Hayek would be seen along these lines, Milton Friedman to a certain extent, etc. and their ideas and priorities becoming consciously fused together by people like William F. Buckley with ideas about tradition, the importance of tradition, the importance of virtue, the importance of what you might call Western civilization. And people like Buckley and others in the 1950s, and another person named Frank Meyer, who wrote a very important book about this very topic and whose name is very much associated with fusionism, basically argued that these two things, liberty on the one hand, liberty, freedom, limited government, all those sorts of things, markets, needed to go together with a respect for tradition, attention to things like virtue, and an awareness that there are many good things in the past that we dispense with at our peril. So in many respects, I think that is what fusionism was, and it was very influential upon prominent conservative and classical liberal thinkers really throughout the 1960s and 1970s. And someone like Ronald Reagan, I think, in some respects, personified that at the level of politics. But if you would talk to many American conservatives in the 1970s and 1980s, and many classical liberals as well, they would have freely embraced this idea of fusionism. And in many respects, I think what's happened over the past 20 years is that fusion has become unfused in a respect. And you have people who say they favor tradition and virtue, seeing themselves at odds with those who say limited government, liberty, etc. are important.
We're looking at a movement that tried to bring together two groups of people who were relatively close on any political scale you would care to use. Mm-hmm. They did have plenty in common. And to use plain language, it's paleocons and libertarians, right? It's people who, as Sam says, believe in freedom to some degree, and they all did to some degree, and people who believed in tradition to some degree, and they all did to some degree. One side more than the other on each note, of course. But those are two groups of people you can bring together and have a civil conversation with, and they can find enough common ground to work together.
Yes.
And yet, as Sam says, they have become unfused or disfused, however you care to look at the verbiage, over time. And anybody looking at the political situation in the United States right now would, I think, come to that conclusion instantaneously, right? You see Ronald Reagan's presidency ending. What is it replaced with? George Bush. It's already lost. And it stays lost for a very long time. To this day, it's lost. But what two groups have come together to apparently come to very similar conclusions? Sam drew our attention to Pat Buchanan, and I think that's as good an exemplar as any, but there are others. You've got this wing of the conservative group of Americans who really are in favor of protectionism and really do want a high level of government involvement in all things economic. And who are they holding hands with? Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. How did we get here?
One of the things I say in the book, I point out in several occasions, is that if you look at the economic policy, not just on specific issues, but even more in a type of generic way, two people who you would think would be completely opposed to each other. So Senator Marco Rubio, who's seen as a sort of conservative senator, very conservative senator, and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who's seen as a sort of very Rooseveltian, modern liberal type of figure. If you look at the way they talk about corporations, or if you look at the way they talk about industrial policy, in fact, I point this out on one of my chapters in the book, The Next American Economy, I point out they're not that far apart from each other. They both want to see industrial policy. They both argue that what they call the blue-collar working class has been left behind as a consequence of a move away from sort of neo-Keynesian arrangements towards what they regard as free market arrangements, etc. Or if you look to even a more vivid example of this dichotomy is Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Both of them very against things like NAFTA. Both in many respects economic nationalists. Both willing to entertain government intervention in a way that limited government conservatives and classical liberals would say that's absolutely out of the question, etc. So you've seen this very strange buildup of, I wouldn't necessarily say they're de facto alliances, but certainly high degree of commonality in the type of prescriptions that they think are necessary and their diagnosis of the problems as well. And that's one of the things my book tries to get to, is how did this happen? Why has this happened? But also why they're wrong, why their diagnosis and the types of policies that they're advocating, in fact, would be detrimental, specifically for some of the groups that they claim to care about.
I want to explore this idea of fusionism a little bit more. You describe the classical liberals and the right, quote unquote, as finding common ground. The thing that has always confused me is why I don't see classical liberals and people on the quote unquote left finding common ground, because it seems to me that there's an overlap there. It's a different overlap, but there's an overlap there just like there's an overlap to the right. My impression is that people on the right are willing to overlook instances of disagreement with classical liberals, whereas people on the left tend not to be.
Yes, I think there's a number of things going on there. Classical liberals generally are very committed to ideals of economic liberty, commercial society, many of the things that were given particular expression in the Scottish Enlightenment. The left, for one period of time, I think in the 1990s, you had the emergence of people like Clinton Democrats, more willing to admit that maybe Keynes wasn't right about everything, more willing to say, well, maybe this protectionist stuff that we've been attached to has turned out to be not so good, more willing to engage the case for economic liberty. Don't forget, for example, it was Bill Clinton who enacted some of the most significant welfare reforms that the country has ever seen. And he did it in alliance with a relatively robust free market Republican crowd in the 1990s. But that group is pretty much, I think, more or less extinct on the left now. So there was a period of time in which I think there were some similarities between some people on the left and some classical liberals when it came to particular economic issues. But I think that's, for the most part, gone now. And the basic point is that on the left, the economic liberty is just not a very high priority at all. In fact, I think it's gotten even worse for them. It's even more about equality, equality, equality. And by that, I don't mean equality before the law, which we call rule of law, which classical liberals and many conservatives have always thought is extremely important for any civilized society. Equality for the left is all embracing. It's all about equality of conditions, equality of starting point, equality of end point, equality of everything in between, and the obliteration of difference. And that, I think, today is where I think you'd find lots of clashes now between what I think is the dominant position on the left and many people who would describe themselves as classical liberals. And I think it comes down to the modern left just have a problem with the type of freedom, the understanding of freedom that classical liberals bring to the discussion.
I get why you want to go to Bill Clinton, and I would too. Of course, he's the great exemplar here. But prior to his becoming president, in the Democratic debates, Paul Tsongas proved himself to be quite a reasonable human being. And he said repeatedly, the American economy is not an ATM. Mm-hmm. You can't just walk up to it and press a couple of buttons and get what you want. And that was so radically different from what we heard before that I had great hope. And then it disappeared as fast as it came.
Or Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Here's another example,
yes,
right?
Exactly so.
Democrat from New York, coming from a particular type of social background, Harvard guy, all that sort of thing, and was the first to really argue. I think it was in 1967, he wrote that report basically arguing that the Great Society programs enacted by Johnson's administration had done enormous damage to African American communities. So he was the first to really come out and say that. He was vigorously attacked by people in the Democratic Party for saying these things. He, in fact, as I'm sure you both know, he ended up working in Richard Nixon's administration at one point, thinking maybe I can ameliorate some of these things. And he realized, no, you can't. There have been periods on the left where you've had some people who are at least aware, at least willing to say There's no magic ATM machine that just instantly produces wealth by fiat, so to speak. Or that maybe we need to consider that expansive state intervention does have some negative consequences that perhaps we should acknowledge. Or someone like Larry Summers, who is willing to say that there is a point at which taxation, if it gets too high, it will start to negatively affect economic growth and other such things. And now he says it's about 55%. We would all say, no, it's a much lower number than that. But at least he was willing to say something like that. And you don't find many people on the left talking that way today. But it's also disturbing, I think, that you find some conservatives now saying, well, maybe we need to expand welfare programs. Maybe we need to have special types of tax carve-outs for any numbers of particular groups of people because we think this is good for society, etc. Maybe we should just give up on trying to reduce the welfare state and use the administrative state to achieve our own ends. I mean, I think there's a considerable body of conservative opinion that now have basically said, we've failed to reduce the size of the administrative state, so we may as well just take it over and use it towards our own ends.
So every 4 years or so, we shift in terms of what we expect the administrative state to accomplish, and nobody questions anymore whether it can accomplish things. And this brings into our political life an evidence-resistant kind of living, right? We don't have to worry about whether we can accomplish these things. All evidence to the contrary, every time out the gate, well, it's going to be different this time. And if it's not, we'll keep putting more money into it. I mean, you see how this is going to work.
Absolutely.
Anybody with a brain sees what's going to happen here, and yet here we are.
In fact, in the book, that's one of the reasons I spend quite a bit of time in the chapter 2, 3, and 4, sort of spelling out all the evidence for why industrial policy not just doesn't work, but why it can't work and why it's bound to have all sorts of very negative economic and political effects, or why, in the end, protectionism is ultimately, you maybe initially change circumstances for select numbers of group for a certain period of time, but in the long term, it cannot help, no matter how much you might wish it to be otherwise. But wishing something to work doesn't mean that it's going to, if all the evidence is very clear that it ends up being damaging economically and politically. And one of the things I try to do in both the book, but in some of the more general debates I've been involved in, is to sort of force people on the right who are going down this path to at least acknowledge that there is a substantive body of well-researched empirical evidence that suggests that these policies that they're proposing cannot help but fail. Because, conservatives tend to say, well, we take the empirical side of life pretty seriously. We do think that measurement matters, that we should be looking at cause and effect and things like that. And, the left have been traditionally the people who have said, no, that's not important. We can just build heaven on earth, and it doesn't matter how long or how difficult it is. We'll get there eventually. Conservatives have always said, no, there is evidence that you need to think about. And it's worrying to me that so many on the right have basically said, evidence is not important anymore. Facts don't matter.
One of perhaps the favorite chapter of mine in your book is Businesses Against Market.
That was my favorite too.
You said something that just keeps resonating with me. I'm going to use this line, and I'm going to paraphrase it badly. A business is interested in freedom for others, but not for itself. And what I parse that to mean is, yeah, everyone else should be playing in a free market environment, but where I'm concerned, government intervention is beneficial. And if the government can intervene on my behalf, that's excellent. One of the things that I found interesting in this chapter is your discussion of stakeholders. And as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about my students. I teach in an MBA program, and I don't teach this. In fact, I don't think any of the economists teach this, but I know business professors do teach the triple bottom line. That is, the business manager has to be concerned not just with the shareholders, but with the stakeholders. That's anyone who the business impacts. And as you talk about stakeholders, I'm left with this question. How do advocates of the stakeholder position, that is, the business has to be concerned with things other than profit, How does the advocate suggest that the business should balance competing interests? For example, paying my workers more, this is good for them, but it's bad for my consumers because they're going to have to pay a higher price. Mm-hmm. As you talk about this, I don't see stakeholder advocates perceiving of trade-offs in this way. I imagine I'm being unfair to them, but what do you say to that?
No, you're not being unfair to them at all. Because I think seriously, because I think if you look at stakeholder theory, so people like E. Edward Friedman, who I think is the foremost advocate of this, that's going back to the 1980s, when he wrote a book called Stakeholder Theory, that's one of the problems they run into. We call it the problem of incommensurability, right? So how do you weigh and balance things that can't be necessarily weighed and balanced against each other? Precisely how much do you trade off for this group rather than another group? This ties into that famous article that Milton Friedman wrote about the social responsibility of businesses to produce a profit. That's the counter-argument. That's the long-standing counter-argument to stakeholder theory. And of course, Friedman doesn't say that businesses are somehow free to just ignore the environment around them, like to pretend that when you set up business in a city, you can't act as if you can be completely oblivious or even hostile to the environment around you, because the business will fail. The business will fail if you completely ignore everyone around you. If you mistreat your employees, I suspect at some point the business is going to fail. If you don't pay attention to particular concerns of people in the community that you're working in, at some point that's going to come back and hurt you. But his point was that none of that is a reason to somehow prioritize these things as being the same as the pursuit of profit, because it's profit, the pursuit of profit and realization of shareholder value. That's the discipline that forces a business to think about all these other things and how they can impact or detract from the company's capacity to produce profit and shareholder value. The stakeholder theorists say profit is just one of many goals that businesses are obliged to follow. And once they go down that path, one of the things I argue is that it inevitably results in profit becoming a very low priority at some point. And it also results, of course, in the whole concept of stakeholder becomes very much focused around, okay, who's the most powerful lobby group that you have to deal with, rather than thinking about how you navigate the different complexities around you. And some of the stakeholder theorists, they go so far as to say that stakeholders should actually be represented on the boards of companies, right? They should be even embedded into the organization itself. And that produces all sorts of conflicts of responsibility, of accountability, transparency, etc. But I happen to think that a lot of businesses are embracing this sort of stuff because they see it as a way to shelter themselves from competition and a way to curry political favor. We all know there are lots of business people who are gung-ho free marketers, except, as you pointed out, when it comes to their own business, right? Mm. Milton Friedman talked about this problem, how business people always say, oh, yes, I believe in competition, except my business is different. My business is somehow particularly special, right? I think it was William Simon Sr., who was Secretary of the Treasury in the 1970s, who said, I'm constantly meeting business people who say they're in favor of markets, except for mine, because mine is so important for the country that you have to give me some sort of support. And I happen to think that stakeholderism is a way for many businesses to play that particular game. It's very, very destructive, I think, of the central telos of what business is about. And I often say to people, look, businesses are not NGOs. NGOs are not businesses. Businesses are not families. Families are not businesses. Things get very messed up very quickly when we start confusing what Aristotle would call the telos of any organization. And that is exactly where stakeholder theory lies and takes us.
And if you think about the mischief that stakeholder theory already causes, and then ask yourself, what constitutes a stakeholder in the first place? And frankly, they believe it's anybody who has an opinion.
Yeah, well, in the book, I point out there was one scholar who went through and searched for definitions of stakeholder, and she found something like, 571 different definitions of what constitutes a stakeholder. It can range from things like, okay, your employees. Now, in classic business theory, there's a way of using the language of stakeholder to describe particular people who are important to the operations of a company, right? But there's also a way of using the language of stakeholder to basically embrace everything and anything. So the environment is a stakeholder, or my friends are stakeholders, or particular pressure groups within my community, they're stakeholders, or the government is a stakeholder, the climate is a stakeholder, the planet is a stakeholder. And when you get into that type of territory, you start to see that the effect is to essentially dilute very, very quickly the distinctiveness of what business is about. And I go on to say that this is the way that business contributes to the general welfare of society. That's its specific contribution by creating profit, shareholder value that creates the economic growth that we all need, that society needs, if it's going to survive, let alone prosper.
What do we do moving from here? How do we turn what we're looking at into something that we might call a win?
That's the second half of the book. And to my mind, it comes back to a number of economic things, but also some, let's call them political, philosophical shifts that we need to make as well. So one of the things I try and do is to talk about the need to rehabilitate entrepreneurship. America is a very entrepreneurial country. We're still the most entrepreneurial country in the world, but levels of entrepreneurship are declining in America and have been for some time. And what's worse, a lot of it's getting channeled into political entrepreneurship. And that's cronyism. That's very, very destructive of the economy. So the revival of entrepreneurship and asking ourselves, what is it that causes obstacles or limits the capacity of people to choose the entrepreneurial path? And I spent a great time talking about that. Another chapter I devote to competition. In terms of other countries, we're not doing super well when it comes to our degree of competitiveness. Some European countries who we might describe as relatively social democratic countries actually rank higher than the United States when it comes to competitiveness. And competitiveness is so important because it introduces so many disciplines into the economy, which we really would not want to do without. That's another thing. And I talk about the obstacles to increased competition. I also talk about the issue of trade and the way that we need to think about revitalizing the case for free trade, because clearly it's on the back foot right now in the United States. But I argue that we need to separate the case for trade liberalization from what you might call globalism. We should be talking about economic free trade, trade liberalization. But that's very different from embracing international organizations, let alone celebrating neo-corporatist outfits like the World Economic Forum. And I think free traders and free marketers in general, we've let ourselves get associated with some of these particular groups. And that's a problem because, for one, they're despised in the United States. But secondly, they're not particularly pro-market, pro-economic liberalization in the first place anyway. So I think we need to certainly revitalize the case for free trade, but we need to do it in a much more politically savvy manner than we've done so in the past. And that leads me to the last point, which is we need to present this case for a shift back towards the market economy in a way that's faithful to America's understanding of itself. We need to avoid talking in sort of generic liberty terms. We need to talk about liberty, but in the context of what I call an American commercial republic, because I think that's a very good way of linking the case for free trade, free markets, economic liberalization, all these things we're in favor of, to America's understanding of what it's meant to be. Because at the moment, protectionists, economic nationalists play the patriot card all the time. And for Americans, it's a very powerful card because Americans generally tend to be much more patriotic and love their country compared to other peoples throughout the world. And it seems to me that free marketers need to challenge economic nationalists on their own grounds and to say, you know, if you go back to what defines America, which I think are the personalities and texts and documents of the founding period in such a powerful way, what you see there being advocated and argued for is a commercial republic, a republic in which commerce is so central to everything that we do, but in which things like what we call Republican virtues and other types of virtues are seen as complementing and as foundational to this type of commercial society that America is meant to be. So that's a political economy argument. It's also a political and philosophical argument as well. And I think those of us who believe in markets need to be much more upfront in grappling with and embracing those types of arguments if we're going to win, not just against those conservatives who've given up on all that, but also the left, who have never believed in these things, who've always believed in top-down control, command and control to various degrees by the administrative state, and enlightened progressives who think that they're in a position to guide the country in the direction that it needs to go.
I want to push back just a little bit here.
Sure.
In the same way that, and I agree with the argument, a business is interested in the level playing field for everybody else, but wants the government intervention for itself. I think you make the same argument with people. A person could say, yeah, freedom is a great thing, except that the government should help me out in the following things. If that's the case for each individual, I don't see how we achieve what you're looking for, because everyone has a vested interest. No matter how much I might say I believe in freedom, I have an interest in the government just intervening for me.
Yes, no, this is definitely a challenge, and it's a challenge that people like Adam Smith identified in The Wealth of Nations. He didn't really like business people. They never gathered together except to engage in some sort of conspiracy against the public. And he was dead right, particularly because he was living in the neo-mercantilist economy that Britain was and the European world was towards the 18th century, where that is how you got ahead. That's how you, through connections, political connections, etc. What that tells me, I think two things are necessary. Self-interest, as you both know, is very much influenced by incentives. Incentives are incredibly important here. And if the incentives overwhelmingly lie towards getting something out of the government, then that's where people will tend to go. A particular type of character who's willing to resist that. So I think that means two things. One is we need to shift incentives away from patronage, playing the crony capitalist game, playing the political game, and move it much more back towards consumers. I say in the book, this is no easy thing. It is not very easy because the degree of interest group resistance will be immense. But I also think that America is different from most other countries in this regard. And I do think that commerce is seen and understood, even today, even in the context where we had the federal government consuming, 37% of GDP on an annual basis, in which we have lots of regulation and all these sorts of things. Americans embrace free commerce in a way that's harder to find in other countries. So I do think we need to talk about this in this particular way, if only to sort of remind people that we're not meant to be decaying European social democracy. So I think it's partly an incentive issue, but it's also a question of rhetoric and pointing out certain traditions that have made America what it is and different from other countries. I don't dispute that this is very hard. I've had people say to me, I agree completely with you. With your book, The Next American Economy, that's exactly the direction we'll be going in, but the obstacles are enormous. To which my response is, but what choice do we have?
This is Samuel Gregg, The Next American Economy. People can find your book on Amazon, and there's an audio version as well I can attest to. It is excellent.
We'll put a link in the show notes to make it real easy for you to find Sam's book. Sam, it's been fantastic having you here with us today. Thanks for making the time.
James and Anthony, thanks for having me on. I love your show. Keep it up.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.